The funeral director's words still echoed in my mind as I stood in the driveway, watching the last of the mourners drive away from what had been the most devastating week of my life. Mrs. Thornbridge, please accept our deepest condolences. Your husband was clearly a beloved man. Beloved. The word felt hollow after everything that had transpired in the 48 hours since we'd lowered Aldrich's casket into the cold ground. I pulled my black coat tighter around my shoulders, the October wind cutting through the fabric like a knife. The house before me looked the same as it had that morning when I'd left for the cemetery, yet everything felt different now. The windows seemed darker, the porch light dimmer, as if the building itself understood that its master would never return. I'd lived in this house for 12 years, ever since Aldrich and I had married, but standing there in that moment, I felt like a stranger approaching someone else's home. The gravel crunched under my heels as I walked toward the front door, fumbling in my purse for the keys that suddenly felt heavier than usual. My fingers were still trembling, whether from grief or the cold, I couldn't tell. The funeral had been everything Aldrich would have wanted, dignified, well attended, with his favorite hymns echoing through the sanctuary of St. Bartholomew's. His colleagues from the law firm had spoken beautifully about his dedication to justice. His neighbors had shared stories of his kindness, and his golf partners had reminisced about his terrible jokes on the course. What struck me most, however, was who hadn't been there. Cordessa Thornbridge, my husband's mother, had been conspicuously absent from every part of the service. No flowers, no condolences, no acknowledgement that her only son had died at the age of 53 from a sudden heart attack that had taken us all by surprise. Her absence had been so glaring that several people had asked me about it, forcing me to make awkward excuses about her being too grief-stricken to attend. The truth was more complicated, as truth usually is in families. Cordessa had disapproved of our marriage from the beginning, viewing me as an unsuitable match for her precious son. She'd made her feelings known in 100 small ways over the years. The birthday cards addressed only to Aldrich, the Christmas gifts that somehow never included anything for me, the family photos displayed prominently in her living room that featured everyone except his wife. Aldrich had tried to smooth things over repeatedly, playing peacemaker between the two most important women in his life, but his efforts had only created a temporary ceasefire rather than genuine resolution. I slipped the key into the lock, surprised by how difficult it was to turn. The mechanism seemed stiff, resistant, as if the house itself was reluctant to let me enter. The hallway was dark when I stepped inside, the familiar scent of Aldrich's cologne still lingering in the air, despite the fact that he'd been gone for a week. I reached for the light switch, but before I could flip it on, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of drilling was coming from the front of the house. My heart began racing as I crept toward the living room window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. What I saw there defied belief. Cordessa Thornbridge stood on my front porch, dressed in her typical black ensemble, directing a man in coveralls who was installing what appeared to be a new lock on my front door. Next to her on the porch were several cardboard boxes that I recognized with growing horror as containing my personal belongings. I watched in stunned silence as the locksmith worked, Cordessa supervising with the imperious air of someone accustomed to having her orders followed without question. She was 72 years old, but carried herself with the rigid posture of someone much younger, her silver hair pulled back in the same severe bun she'd worn for as long as I'd known her. Her pale blue eyes, so similar to Aldrich's, surveyed the locksmith's work with the satisfaction of someone whose plans were proceeding exactly as expected. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This woman, who had barely acknowledged my existence for 12 years, who had skipped her own son's funeral, was now standing on my porch, changing the locks as if she owned the place. I wanted to storm outside immediately, to demand an explanation, to assert my rights as Aldrich's widow and the legal owner of this property. But something held me back. Perhaps intuition, perhaps the survival instinct that had served me well during my years as a social worker, dealing with difficult families. Instead, I remained hidden behind the curtain, watching and listening as Cordessa inspected the locksmith's work. She tested the new lock several times, nodding with approval each time it clicked into place. The man packed up his tools, handed her something that must have been the new keys, and departed in a van marked Bellwether Security Services. Only then did Cordessa turn toward the front door, her expression one of grim determination. The doorbell rang 3 times in quick succession, the chimes echoing through the house with an urgency that seemed almost aggressive. I took a deep breath, smoothed my funeral dress, and walked to the door with measured steps. When I opened it, Cordessa stood there with her hands folded in front of her, the picture of righteous authority. "Good afternoon, Evangeline," she said, her voice carrying the same formal tone she'd used with me for over a decade. She'd never called me by a nickname, never allowed our relationship to develop the warmth that might have justified more casual address. I trust the funeral arrangements were adequate. The word adequate hit me like a slap. My husband's funeral, the final goodbye to the man I'd loved more than life itself, was adequate in her estimation. "Hello, Cordessa," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the fury building inside me. "I'm surprised to see you here, given that you chose not to attend your son's funeral." Her expression didn't change, but I caught a slight tightening around her eyes. "I had my reasons for staying away. Grief affects people differently, as I'm sure you understand." "I understand that your son would have been heartbroken by your absence," I said, stepping back to allow her entry into the house. "But you're here now. What can I do for you?" Cordessa moved past me into the hallway, her sharp gaze taking in every detail as if she were conducting an inventory. She'd been in this house only a handful of times during my marriage to Aldrich, usually for obligatory holiday visits that lasted precisely long enough to be considered polite. Now she moved through the space with the confidence of someone who belonged there. "I've come to discuss the future," she announced, turning to face me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Specifically, the future of this house and your continued residence here." The casual way she said it, as if we were discussing weekend plans rather than my home and livelihood, made my hands clench into fists at my sides. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand what you mean." Cordessa walked into the living room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors that Aldrich and I had refinished together the previous spring. She paused next to the mantelpiece where our wedding photos sat alongside pictures from various vacations and family gatherings. Her fingers traced the edge of our wedding picture frame, and for a moment, something almost like sadness flickered across her features. "This house," she said finally, was purchased by my late husband, Roderick Thornbridge, in 1987. When Roderick died, it passed to Aldrich as his only heir. Now that Aldrich is gone, it reverts to me as the surviving parent and nearest blood relative. I felt the room spin slightly, as if the foundation beneath my feet had suddenly shifted. Cordessa, that's not how inheritance law works. Aldrich and I were married. As his spouse, I inherit his property automatically unless there's a will stating otherwise. She turned from the mantelpiece with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, my dear Evangeline, but there is a will, a very specific, very legal will that Aldrich signed just 6 months ago. I have a copy with me, if you'd like to review it. From her black leather purse, she withdrew a folded document that looked official and intimidating. My hand shook as I took it, recognizing immediately the letterhead of Morrison, Phillips and Associates, the law firm where Aldrich had worked for the past 8 years. The will was dated 4 months before his death, bearing his signature and those of 2 witnesses whose names I didn't recognize. As I read through the legal language, my world began to crumble around me. According to this document, Aldrich had left everything: the house, his savings, his life insurance policy, even his car, to his mother, Cordessa Thornbridge. The only mention of me was a brief paragraph stating that my wife Evangeline shall receive my personal effects and clothing, with the understanding that she will vacate the family home within 30 days of my death. "This can't be real," I whispered, reading the will again to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. Aldrich would never have done this. He loved me. We were happy. Cordessa settled herself onto our sofa with the air of someone who had every right to be there. Love and practicality are 2 different things, my dear. Aldrich realized, perhaps belatedly, that blood family should always come first. This house has been in the Thornbridge family for decades. It was never appropriate for an outsider to inherit it. The word outsider stung more than I wanted to admit. After 12 years of marriage, after building a life with Aldrich in this house, after nursing him through a bout of pneumonia 2 winters ago and celebrating every promotion and achievement together, I was still an outsider in his mother's eyes. "I don't believe this," I said, my voice growing stronger with conviction. Aldrich never mentioned changing his will. He never gave any indication that he was unhappy with our marriage or that he wanted to leave everything to you. "Men don't always share their deepest concerns with their wives," Cordessa replied, her tone maddeningly calm, particularly when those concerns involve the very women they're married to. The implication hit me like a physical blow. She was suggesting that Aldrich had doubts about our marriage, doubts so significant that he'd felt compelled to disinherit me entirely. I thought about our last conversation, the morning before his heart attack. We'd been planning a trip to Scotland for our 13th anniversary, discussing which castles we wanted to visit and whether we should rent a car or take organized tours. He'd kissed me goodbye as he left for work, the same kiss he'd given me nearly every morning for 12 years. "This is impossible," I said, sinking into the chair across from her. "There has to be some mistake." "There's no mistake," Cordessa assured me, reaching into her purse again. "I've already filed the will with the probate court. The house legally belongs to me now, which is why I took the liberty of having the locks changed. I'm giving you until the end of the week to collect your personal belongings and find alternative accommodations." The casual cruelty of it, took my breath away. She was evicting me from my own home 3 days after my husband's funeral, treating me like a tenant whose lease had expired rather than a grieving widow who just lost everything that mattered to her. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, hating how small and lost my voice sounded. "This is my home. Everything I have is here." "That's not my concern," Cordessa replied, standing up and smoothing her skirt. "You're a capable woman, Evangeline. I'm sure you'll figure something out. Perhaps this is an opportunity for you to start fresh, find a new life more suited to your circumstances." There was something in the way she said circumstances that made me look at her more closely. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I caught a glint in her eyes that suggested she knew something I didn't. It was the look of someone holding cards they hadn't yet played, savoring the moment before revealing their winning hand. "What aren't you telling me?" I asked, rising to my feet as well. "This whole situation feels wrong. The timing, the will, your sudden appearance after years of barely acknowledging that Aldrich and I existed." Cordessa moved toward the front door, pausing to examine one of the photographs hanging in our hallway. It was a picture from our wedding day, Aldrich and me laughing at something his best man had said during the reception. We looked so young and hopeful, so certain that we had a lifetime of happiness ahead of us. "Sometimes," she said without turning around, "we discover that the people we think we know best are the ones keeping the most secrets. Aldrich was my son, Evangeline. I knew him long before you did, and I knew him in ways you never could." She opened the front door, and I could see the boxes of my belongings stacked neatly on the porch. The sight of my life reduced to cardboard containers was almost more than I could bear. "I've packed what appeared to be your most essential items," Cordessa continued. "The movers will come tomorrow for the furniture and larger pieces. I trust you'll have found somewhere to store them by then." "You can't do this," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "I'll contest the will. I'll hire a lawyer. There has to be something illegal about this whole situation." For the first time since her arrival, Cordessa's composure cracked slightly. A flash of something, anger perhaps, or fear, crossed her face before she regained control. "You're welcome to try," she said, her voice ice cold. "But I think you'll find that Aldrich was very thorough in his planning. He consulted with some of the best legal minds in the city to ensure that his wishes would be carried out exactly as he intended." She stepped onto the porch, then turned back to face me one final time. "Oh, and Evangeline, I wouldn't waste time trying to contact Aldrich's colleagues at the law firm. They're all quite aware of the situation and have been instructed not to discuss the matter with you." With that, she walked down the front steps and climbed into her pristine silver Cadillac, leaving me standing in the doorway of what was no longer my home. I watched her drive away, my mind reeling from everything that had just happened. The woman who had treated me like an unwelcome stranger for 12 years had just taken everything I had left in the world, armed with legal documents that seemed to strip me of any rights as Aldrich's widow. But as I stood there watching her taillights disappear around the corner, something began nagging at me. There were details about this situation that didn't add up, inconsistencies that suggested all was not as it appeared. The timing of the will, the convenient absence from the funeral, the way she'd had my belongings packed and ready before even telling me about the inheritance change. It all felt too orchestrated, too convenient. I walked back into the house, noting that Cordessa had indeed had the locks changed. The new keys sat on the hall table where she'd left them, a tangible reminder of my changed circumstances. But instead of despair, I felt something else beginning to stir inside me: curiosity, and perhaps the first glimmer of suspicion that this entire situation might not be as legally sound as Cordessa wanted me to believe. My first call was to Jennifer Castenberg, the attorney who'd handled the legal work when Aldrich and I had bought the house. She was a sharp woman in her 40s who'd built her practice on helping families navigate complex real estate and inheritance issues. Evangeline? Jennifer's voice was warm with sympathy when she answered. I heard about Aldrich. I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you, I managed, then quickly explained what had just transpired with Cordessa and the will. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. That's unusual, Jennifer said finally. Can you bring me a copy of this will? I'd like to examine it before we discuss your options. Cordessa left a copy with me. I can be at your office in 20 minutes. Make it 30, Jennifer replied. I want to pull the file from when you and Aldrich purchased the house. There might be something there that's relevant to this situation. The drive to Jennifer's office gave me time to think about the last few months of my marriage, searching for any signs that Aldrich had been planning something like this. He'd been working longer hours recently, but that wasn't unusual for a senior associate at a busy law firm. He'd seemed distracted sometimes, but I'd attributed that to stress from a particularly difficult case he'd been handling. There had been no major arguments, no discussions about money or property, certainly nothing that would suggest he was planning to disinherit me. Jennifer's office was located in a converted Victorian house downtown, its warm wood paneling and oriental rugs creating an atmosphere of stability and tradition. She met me in the reception area, her expression grave as she led me to her private office. Before we look at the will, she said, settling behind her desk, I want you to understand something. Under state law, a spouse has certain inheritance rights that are very difficult to circumvent. Even if Aldrich did sign a valid will, leaving everything to his mother, you would typically be entitled to claim what's called an elective share of his estate. This was the first hopeful thing I'd heard all day. What does that mean exactly? It means that regardless of what a will says, a surviving spouse can usually claim a percentage of the deceased spouse's estate, typically around 1/3. It's designed to prevent exactly the kind of situation you're describing. I handed her the copy of Aldrich's will, watching her face carefully as she read through it. Her expression grew increasingly puzzled as she turned the pages. This is highly irregular, she said, after several minutes. The language is much more complex than it needs to be for a simple inheritance transfer, and there are several clauses here that seem designed specifically to waive your spousal rights, which requires very specific legal procedures. What kind of procedures? Jennifer pulled a thick law book from her shelf and flipped through it quickly. For a will affected to waive spousal inheritance rights, the surviving spouse typically has to sign a separate document acknowledging the waiver. Did you ever sign anything like that? Never, I said firmly. I would have remembered something that significant. Then this will may not be legally enforceable, Jennifer said, her voice growing more confident. But there's something else that bothers me about this document. The witnesses listed here, I don't recognize either name, and I know most of the attorneys and legal staff in this area. She reached for her phone and dialed a number. Morrison, Phillips and Associates. This is Jennifer Castenberg. I'm calling about a will that was allegedly executed by one of your employees, Aldrich Thornbridge. I see. Could you transfer me to someone who worked with him directly? I listened to one side of a conversation that seemed to be growing more interesting by the minute. Jennifer's eyebrows rose several times, and she made notes on a legal pad as she talked. "Thank you. That's very helpful," she said finally, hanging up the phone. She turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Well?" I prompted. According to Aldrich's paralegal, he never mentioned preparing a personal will through the firm. In fact, she specifically remembers him saying just last month that he and his wife had been meaning to update their wills but hadn't gotten around to it yet. The room felt like it was spinning again, but this time in a good way. So the will is fake? I can't say that definitively without more investigation, Jennifer cautioned, but there are enough irregularities here to warrant serious scrutiny. The question is, if this will is fraudulent, who created it and why? I thought about Cordessa's behavior, her conspicuous absence from the funeral, the way she'd had my belongings packed before even showing me the will. His mother has never liked me. She's made that clear from the beginning. But would she really go this far? Grief makes people do strange things, Jennifer said diplomatically, but so does greed. If this house and Aldrich's other assets are valuable enough, someone might think it's worth the risk of document fraud. She stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the street below. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm filing an emergency injunction to prevent any transfer of property until we can have this will properly examined by a forensics expert. I'm also going to contact the probate court to request a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding this document's creation. Relief flooded through me for the first time since Cordessa had appeared on my doorstep. How long will that take? A few weeks, maybe a month if we're lucky. In the meantime, you have every legal right to remain in your house. If Mrs. Thornbridge tries to force you out or interfere with your access to the property, we can have her arrested for harassment. I left Jennifer's office feeling like I could breathe again for the first time in hours. The late afternoon sun was painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and for the first time since Aldrich's death, the world didn't seem completely dark. I had a plan now, legal representation, and most importantly, hope that this nightmare might have an end. But as I drove back toward the house, I noticed a familiar silver Cadillac parked across the street. Cordessa was sitting behind the wheel, watching my house with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. When she saw my car approaching, she started her engine and drove away, but not before rolling down her window and giving me a look that was equal parts smugness and warning. I parked in my driveway and walked up to the front door, using the new keys she'd left for me. The house felt different now, somehow violated by her presence and her claims of ownership, but it was still my home, still filled with 12 years of memories and love, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me without a fight. That evening, I sat in Aldrich's study, surrounded by his law books and legal journals, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. His computer was still password protected, but I knew the password, our wedding anniversary, followed by my birthday. If he'd been planning something as drastic as changing his will, surely there would be some evidence of it in his email or files. What I found there, however, was far more disturbing than I'd expected. Hidden in a folder labeled Personal Research were dozens of documents related to inheritance law, spousal rights, and something called estate planning strategies. The files were dated from 6 months ago, right around the time the fake will had allegedly been signed. But the most shocking discovery was a series of email exchanges between Aldrich and someone named Marcus Bellwether, the same last name as the locksmith company that had changed our locks. The emails were cryptic, filled with references to the plan and making sure everything is legally bulletproof. The final email, sent just 2 weeks before Aldrich's death, contained a single line that made my blood run cold. Phase 1 complete. Ready to implement Phase 2 upon your signal. I sat back in Aldrich's leather chair, my mind struggling to process what I was reading. If these emails were real, it suggested that my husband had indeed been planning something elaborate and secretive. But the tone of the messages didn't sound like someone planning to disinherit his wife. They sounded like someone preparing for something much more complex, something that required careful timing and coordination. My phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. The caller ID showed Jennifer Castenberg's office number. Evangeline. Jennifer's voice was tight with excitement. I've been doing some research on that will, and I think we may have hit the jackpot. The notary stamp on the document, it belongs to someone who had their license revoked 3 months ago for fraudulent practices. Whatever this document is, it's definitely not legitimate. That's wonderful news, I said, but even as I spoke, I was thinking about the emails I'd just discovered. Jennifer, there's something else. I found some files on Aldrich's computer that suggest he might have been planning something, but I can't figure out what. What kind of files? I described the emails and documents, watching through the study window as Cordessa's Cadillac made another slow pass by the house. There's something bigger going on here than just a greedy mother-in-law trying to steal my inheritance. Forward me those emails, Jennifer said immediately. And Evangeline, don't stay in that house alone tonight. If there's some kind of elaborate plan in motion, we don't know how far these people are willing to go to protect it. After hanging up, I forwarded the emails to Jennifer, and then sat in the growing darkness, thinking about the man I'd married and loved for 12 years. Had I really known Aldrich Thornbridge at all? Was it possible that he'd been planning something this elaborate without me having the slightest suspicion? As I pondered these questions, headlights swept across the study window again. But this time, instead of driving past, the car turned into my driveway. I peered through the curtains and saw not Cordessa's Cadillac, but a dark sedan with tinted windows. 2 men in suits got out and walked purposefully toward my front door. My heart began racing as the doorbell rang. These weren't social visitors, and they definitely weren't friends come to offer condolences. They had the look of men conducting business, serious business that probably wouldn't end well for me. I didn't answer the door, instead retreating deeper into the house and grabbing my phone. But before I could dial Jennifer's number, I heard something that made my blood freeze, the sound of a key turning in the lock. Whoever these men were, they had access to my house. I crept to the study window and carefully peered out, trying to see if there were more cars or people outside. The street appeared empty, except for the dark sedan, but that didn't mean much. If this was part of some elaborate plan that Aldrich had been involved in, there could be people positioned anywhere. The sound of footsteps in my hallway made me press myself against the wall, trying to think of an escape route. The study had a window that opened onto the back garden, but it was a 15-foot drop to the ground. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by low voices that I couldn't quite make out. "Mrs. Thornbridge?" A man's voice called out. "Mrs. Evangeline Thornbridge, we know you're here. We just want to talk." Something about the formal way he addressed me, combined with his calm tone, made me hesitate. These didn't sound like criminals or thugs. They sounded more like officials. "Who are you?" I called back, still pressed against the study wall. "Federal agents, ma'am. We have identification. We need to speak with you about your husband's activities." Federal agents? I felt the world shift beneath my feet once again. What could federal agents possibly want with Aldrich, or with me? He was a family law attorney who handled divorces and custody disputes. The most controversial thing he'd ever been involved in was a heated argument over a property settlement. "Show me your identification through the door," I said, moving cautiously toward the hallway. Two men stood in my entryway, both wearing dark suits and serious expressions. The taller one held up a leather wallet containing what appeared to be an official FBI badge and identification card. "Agent Carmichael," he introduced himself. "This is Agent Rodriguez. We apologize for the intrusion, Mrs. Thornbridge, but we have some urgent questions about your husband's recent activities." I opened the door fully, studying their faces for any sign of deception. They looked legitimate, but after everything that had happened today, I wasn't taking anything at face value. "How did you get keys to my house?" I asked. "We were given them by Mrs. Cordessa Thornbridge," Agent Rodriguez explained. "She contacted our office this afternoon and said you might be in possession of certain materials that belong to a federal investigation." The pieces of this puzzle were becoming more confusing by the minute. What kind of materials, and what investigation? Agent Carmichael exchanged a look with his partner before answering. "Mrs. Thornbridge, your husband was working with our office on a very sensitive case involving financial crimes and document fraud. He'd been gathering evidence for us for the past 6 months." I sank into the nearest chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. "Aldrich was working with the FBI?" "Not officially," Agent Rodriguez clarified. "He came to us when he discovered that certain clients of his law firm were involved in an elaborate money laundering operation. Rather than simply report what he'd found, he volunteered to help us gather additional evidence." "We understand this is a lot to process," Agent Carmichael added gently, "especially given your recent loss. But Mr. Thornbridge was very concerned about your safety. He was afraid that when the investigation became public, you might be targeted by the people he was helping us investigate." The emails I'd found on Aldrich's computer suddenly made more sense. The plan he was working on, it wasn't about changing his will or disinheriting me. He was working with you. "Exactly," Agent Rodriguez confirmed. "The will you were shown today is part of an elaborate deception designed to protect you. By making it appear that you'd lost all claim to his assets, we hope to convince the criminals that you had no knowledge of his investigation and no access to evidence that could harm them." I felt tears starting to flow, but they were tears of relief rather than grief. So Aldrich didn't really leave everything to his mother. "Not at all," Agent Carmichael assured me. "His real will, which we have in our possession, leaves everything to you exactly as you would expect. Mrs. Cordessa Thornbridge has been cooperating with our investigation, though we understand her performance today was quite convincing." The sound of another car in the driveway made all three of us turn toward the window. A familiar silver Cadillac was pulling up behind the agent's sedan, and I could see Cordessa getting out with what appeared to be several grocery bags. She's been staying at a hotel for the past week, monitoring the situation and waiting for us to make contact with you, Agent Rodriguez explained. We needed to be sure that the people your husband was investigating would take the bait and believe you were truly dispossessed. Cordessa appeared at the front door, using her key to enter just as she had that afternoon. But now, instead of the cold formality she'd shown earlier, her expression was one of concern and exhaustion. "Oh, Evangeline," she said, setting down the grocery bags and approaching me with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry for what I put you through today. I hated every minute of it. But Aldrich made me promise to protect you, no matter what it took." I stared at her in shock. This was the same woman who had been evicting me from my home just hours earlier, but now she was looking at me with what appeared to be genuine affection. "I don't understand," I managed. "You've barely spoken to me in 12 years. You missed Aldrich's funeral. How is any of this protecting me?" Cordessa sat down beside me, reaching for my hands with a gentleness I'd never experienced from her before. "Everything I've done for the past 12 years has been about protecting you, dear. But I couldn't let you know that, because Aldrich was afraid that if you knew the truth about his work, you'd insist on being involved, and that would have put you in terrible danger." Agent Carmichael cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should explain the full situation now that Mrs. Thornbridge is secure." As the agents began to outline the scope of Aldrich's investigation and the elaborate deception that had been constructed to protect me, I found myself looking at my mother-in-law with completely new eyes. The woman I'd thought hated me had actually been playing a role designed to keep me safe. The coldness and distance I'd interpreted as rejection had been a carefully constructed barrier meant to protect both of us from people who wouldn't hesitate to use family connections as leverage. But even as the agents talked and Cordessa held my hands, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were still pieces of this puzzle missing. The elaborate nature of the deception, the involvement of federal agents, the months of planning, it all suggested something much bigger than a simple money laundering case. And despite their explanations, I had the distinct impression that I was still not hearing the complete truth about what my husband had been involved in, or why my protection had required such extreme measures. Agent Rodriguez was speaking about safe houses and witness protection protocols when I noticed something that made me focus intently on his words. He'd mentioned that the investigation involved not just money laundering, but also document fraud and identity theft, the same crimes that had been mentioned in connection with the notary who'd supposedly verified Aldrich's fake will. "The notary whose stamp was on the will," I interrupted, "the one whose license was revoked, was she part of this investigation?" The agents exchanged another look, and I could see them weighing how much to tell me. "We believe so," Agent Carmichael said finally. "But, Mrs. Thornbridge, there are aspects of this case that are still ongoing. For your own safety, there are some details we can't share with you yet." Cordessa squeezed my hands. "What matters now is that you're safe, and that Aldrich's real wishes will be honored. The house is yours, the money is yours, and we can finally stop pretending that we're strangers." I looked around the living room where I'd spent so many evenings with Aldrich, trying to reconcile everything I'd learned with the life I thought I'd been living. My husband had been leading a double life, working with federal agents to bring down criminals. My mother-in-law, whom I'd thought despised me, had been protecting me through an elaborate charade. And somewhere out there, dangerous people were presumably still unaware that their plan to eliminate a key witness had failed. "What happens now?" I asked, suddenly feeling the exhaustion of the day catching up with me. "Now we wait," Agent Rodriguez said. "The people your husband was investigating believe you've been disinherited and posed no threat to them. That gives us time to build our case and ensure your continued safety." But as I sat there surrounded by federal agents and the mother-in-law who just revealed herself to be my protector rather than my enemy, I couldn't shake the feeling that waiting might not be enough. If Aldrich had taught me anything during our years together, it was that sometimes the best defense was a good offense. And something told me that before this was over, I was going to need to take a much more active role in finishing what my husband had started. The evening light was fading outside, casting long shadows across the room where my life had been turned upside down and right side up again in the span of a single day. But as I looked at Cordessa, really looked at her for perhaps the first time, I began to understand that this story was far from over. In fact, I was beginning to suspect it had barely begun. The realization hit me like cold water. I turned to Agent Carmichael, studying his composed expression with new suspicion. "You're not telling me everything. If this was just about money laundering, you wouldn't need such an elaborate deception. And you certainly wouldn't need federal agents camping out in my living room." Cordessa's grip on my hands tightened almost imperceptibly, and I caught a flash of something, warning perhaps, in her eyes before she masked it again. The pieces were shifting in my mind, forming a picture that was far more complex than anyone wanted me to see. "What exactly was Aldrich investigating?" I pressed, standing up despite Cordessa's attempt to keep me seated. "And don't give me another carefully worded non-answer. I'm done being protected from the truth." Agent Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving unconsciously toward his jacket. The gesture wasn't lost on me, and it told me more about the level of danger involved than any of their careful explanations had. "Mrs. Thornbridge," Agent Carmichael began, "there are national security implications." "Stop!" I held up my hand, feeling a surge of clarity cut through the confusion of the day. "My husband is dead. Someone has been playing elaborate games with my life, and now you're telling me there are national security implications? I think I deserve to know what my husband died for." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken communication between the agents and Cordessa. I watched their faces, reading the micro-expressions that revealed the depth of what they weren't saying. Finally, Cordessa stood up, smoothing her skirt in that precise way she'd always done when making difficult decisions. "She needs to know," she said quietly. "Aldrich was very specific about that. If something happened to him, if the situation escalated beyond what we could control, she was to be told everything." Agent Carmichael's jaw tightened. "That's not protocol, ma'am." "Protocol didn't include my son having a heart attack at 53, Cordessa replied, her voice carrying an authority I'd never heard from her before. "And it certainly didn't include his widow being left completely in the dark about why her life has been turned upside down." I looked between them, sensing that I was witnessing a power struggle that had been ongoing long before today. "How long have you been involved in this, Cordessa? because I'm starting to think my marriage was built on a foundation of lies I never suspected. She turned to face me fully, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw her mask slip completely. The composed, cold woman I'd spent 12 years trying to win over was gone, replaced by someone who looked exhausted, grief-stricken, and terrifyingly determined. "Your marriage was the one real thing in this entire situation," she said firmly. "Aldrich loved you more than life itself. Everything else, my coldness, the distance I maintained, even the funeral I missed, all of that was part of keeping you safe from people who would have used you to get to him." Agent Rodriguez was speaking quietly into his phone, and I caught fragments of conversation that included words like compromise and immediate extraction. The urgency in his voice made my pulse quicken. "Evangeline," Cordessa continued, "your husband discovered that several high-ranking government officials were using his law firm to launder money from arms sales to foreign terrorist organizations. Not just money laundering, we're talking about funding groups that have killed American soldiers overseas." The room seemed to tilt around me. This wasn't white-collar crime or even organized crime. This was treason. "The documents Aldrich gathered didn't just implicate local criminals," she went on. "They implicated a United States senator, 2 federal judges, and at least 3 Pentagon officials, people with the power to make inconvenient witnesses disappear permanently." Agent Carmichael had finished his phone conversation and was now looking at me with something approaching sympathy. "Your husband came to us because he couldn't live with what he'd discovered, but he also couldn't live with the thought of putting you in danger. So we developed a plan." "The plan being to fake his death?" I asked, though even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Aldrich's heart attack had been real. I'd been with him in the hospital when he died. "No," Cordessa said softly. "The plan was to make it appear that you knew nothing about his investigation and had no access to any evidence he might have left behind. We needed to make you appear worthless as a target." I sank back into my chair, the full scope of what they'd done beginning to sink in. "So, you let me think I'd lost everything. You let me grieve not just for my husband, but for the life we'd built together." "It was supposed to be temporary," Agent Rodriguez explained, "just long enough for us to arrest the primary targets and neutralize the threat. But Aldrich's death complicated everything." "How?" I demanded. The agents exchanged another look, and I could see them weighing their options. Finally, Agent Carmichael spoke. "Because the evidence your husband gathered is hidden somewhere that only he knew about. We've searched his office, his computer files, everywhere we could think of. But whatever he found, whatever proof he had of the conspiracy, it's somewhere we haven't been able to locate." A cold realization began to creep through me. "And you think I might know where it is?" "We hoped you might," Agent Rodriguez admitted, "but we also knew that if you started actively searching for evidence, it would signal to the conspirators that you knew more than we wanted them to believe." I looked around the room where I'd spent so many quiet evenings with Aldrich, reading or watching television while he worked on cases. Had he been hiding evidence of treason somewhere in our home? Had I been living with proof of government corruption without ever knowing it? "There's something else," Cordessa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The people Aldrich was investigating. They've been watching you since his death. They're not convinced by our deception. They think you know where the evidence is hidden, and they're growing impatient." As if summoned by her words, Agent Rodriguez's phone buzzed. He answered it quickly, his expression growing increasingly grim as he listened. When he hung up, he turned to us with an urgency that made my stomach clench. "We have a problem," he announced. "3 vehicles just turned onto this street, and they're not ours. We need to move you now." Through the front window, I could see headlights approaching slowly, methodically, like hunters who had finally cornered their prey. The house that had been my sanctuary, my home, was about to become a trap. "Back door," Agent Carmichael ordered, drawing his weapon. "There's a car waiting in the alley behind the house." But as we moved toward the kitchen, the sound of shattering glass from the study made us all freeze. Someone had broken in through the window I'd been considering as an escape route earlier. We were surrounded. "Upstairs," Cordessa whispered urgently. "There's something Aldrich wanted you to have if this ever happened." We crept up the staircase as quietly as possible, the sounds of systematic searching drifting up from below. These weren't random criminals looking for valuables. They were professionals, methodically going through the house with the efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. Cordessa led us to the master bedroom, but instead of heading for the obvious hiding places, she went straight to the walk-in closet. In the back corner, behind a row of Aldrich's suits that I'd been unable to bring myself to pack away, she began running her hands along the baseboard. "Here," she breathed, and I heard a soft click. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a space I'd never known existed. Inside was a small safe, and beside it, an envelope with my name written in Aldrich's handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it, finding a letter that would explain everything I'd been too afraid to ask about my husband's final months. "My dearest Evangeline," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then the worst has happened, and I'm no longer here to protect you. By now, you know about my work with the FBI, and you probably feel betrayed by all the secrets I kept from you. Please understand that every lie I told, every truth I withheld, was because I loved you too much to watch you live in fear." The sounds of searching below were getting closer, and I could hear voices now. Low, professional, dangerous. I continued reading quickly. "The evidence that could bring down this conspiracy is in the safe behind this letter. But, Evangeline, I need you to understand something crucial. This information is so dangerous that possessing it makes you a target for the rest of your life. If you take it, there will be no going back to the quiet life we built together." My heart was pounding as I reached the end of the letter. The combination to the safe is the date we first said we loved each other, the night we got caught in the rain outside the movie theater. You'll remember. But before you open it, know that I'm giving you a choice I never had. You can walk away from all of this. The agents will get you to safety, and you can start over somewhere new. Or you can finish what I started and help bring justice to the people who've betrayed our country. The choice is yours, and I'll love you regardless of what you decide. I looked up to find Cordessa, Agent Carmichael, and Agent Rodriguez, all watching me intently. Below us, the sounds had stopped, which somehow felt more ominous than the searching had. "October 15th, 2009, I whispered, remembering the night Aldrich had walked me home through an unexpected downpour, both of us laughing and soaked to the skin. We'd taken shelter under the awning of a closed shop, and he'd kissed me for the first time, then pulled back to tell me he was falling in love with me. The safe clicked open, revealing a thick manila envelope, and what appeared to be several data storage devices. Even without examining the contents, I could tell this represented months of painstaking evidence gathering. Agent Rodriguez was monitoring something on his phone, his expression growing increasingly tense. "They're in the hallway downstairs," he whispered. "We have maybe 2 minutes before they reach us." I stared at the contents of the safe, thinking about Aldrich's words. I could walk away. I could let the federal agents handle this and try to build a new life somewhere far from all of this danger and deception. It would be safer, simpler, and probably what Aldrich would want for me. But as I thought about my husband working alone for months, gathering evidence of crimes that had cost American lives while trying to protect me from the consequences, I realized that walking away wasn't really an option. Not for me, and not for the memory of the man who died trying to do the right thing. "I'm not running," I said, grabbing the envelope and storage devices from the safe. "These people killed my husband as surely as if they'd put a gun to his head. The stress of what he was carrying, the weight of keeping these secrets, it stopped his heart at 53. Cordessa's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded with something that looked like pride. "He knew you'd make that choice. He told me you were the strongest person he'd ever known." The sound of footsteps on the stairs made us all tense. Agent Carmichael moved to the bedroom door, weapon drawn, while Agent Rodriguez positioned himself by the window. But before anyone could make another move, a voice called out from the hallway, "Mrs. Thornbridge, we know you're up there. We just want to talk." It was the same calm, professional tone the agents had used earlier, but something about it made my skin crawl. These weren't people who just wanted to talk. "We also know you have something that belongs to us," the voice continued. "Something your husband took that wasn't his to take. Return it, and no one gets hurt." I looked at the evidence in my hands, thinking about what Aldrich had written about the choice I was making. There was no going back now. Whatever happened next, I was committed to seeing this through. "How many of them are there?" I whispered to Agent Rodriguez. "At least 6 that we've identified," he replied quietly. "Probably more outside." The bedroom door suddenly exploded inward as someone kicked it with tremendous force. Agent Carmichael fired twice, and I heard someone cry out in pain. But then there were more figures in the doorway, and everything descended into chaos. Cordessa grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the master bathroom while the agents engaged in a firefight that seemed impossibly loud in the enclosed space. "There's another way out," she said urgently. "Aldrich had it installed last year." In the bathroom, she opened what I'd always thought was a linen closet to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. As we descended, I could hear the gunfire continuing above us, along with shouts and the sound of more windows breaking. The staircase ended in the basement, but not the basement I knew. This was a section I'd never seen, hidden behind the furnace area where Cordessa had supposedly hidden her safe. The walls were lined with monitors showing feeds from security cameras I hadn't known existed, and there was communication equipment that looked military grade. "Aldrich built this over the past year," Cordessa explained, moving to a console and beginning to type rapidly. "He knew this day might come." On the monitors, I could see figures moving through our house with tactical precision. These weren't garden variety criminals. They moved like soldiers, like people trained in urban warfare. "Who are they?" I asked, though I was starting to suspect I already knew. Private military contractors, Cordessa replied, not looking up from the console. The kind of people the government uses when they need something done quietly and efficiently. The implication hit me like a physical blow. They're not just criminals, they're working for someone in the government. Someone very highly placed, she confirmed. Someone with the authority to deploy assets like this against American citizens on American soil. Through the monitors, I watched as the gunfight upstairs intensified. Agent Carmichael was wounded, blood visible on his left shoulder, but he and Agent Rodriguez were holding their position near the staircase. More figures were moving through the house, searching systematically through every room. We need to get this evidence to someone we can trust, I said, clutching the manila envelope. But how do we know who's safe to contact? Cordessa's fingers flew over the keyboard, and suddenly one of the monitors showed a split screen with multiple news stations. We don't contact anyone, she said grimly. We broadcast everything simultaneously to every major media outlet in the country. Once it's public, it becomes much harder for them to silence us. I stared at her in amazement. You know how to do that. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, she smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face. My dear Evangeline, where do you think Aldrich learned about computer security and surveillance? I worked for the CIA for 25 years before I retired to play the role of a disapproving mother-in-law. The revelation was so unexpected that I actually laughed, a sound that felt surreal amid the chaos surrounding us. You're a spy? Was a spy, she corrected. But, apparently, retirement doesn't last long when your son stumbles onto a conspiracy that threatens national security. On the monitors, I could see that more vehicles had arrived outside. The tactical team was being reinforced, which meant we had very little time before they found this hidden room. How long do you need to upload everything? I asked, opening the manila envelope and beginning to sort through its contents. 10 minutes, maybe 15 if the files are large. I began examining Aldrich's evidence, and what I found there made me understand why these people were willing to commit murder to keep it secret. Bank records showing millions of dollars flowing from arms sales to known terrorist organizations, recorded phone conversations between high-ranking officials discussing weapons shipments, photographs of clandestine meetings between American politicians and foreign agents. But the most damning evidence was a series of emails discussing the elimination of problematic witnesses, including a detailed plan to cause Aldrich's heart attack using an untraceable chemical compound. They murdered him, I breathed, staring at the documents. They actually murdered my husband. Cordessa looked up from her typing, her expression grim. We suspected as much, but we had no proof until now. The sound of explosions from upstairs made the entire basement shake. Through the monitors, I could see that the tactical team had brought in more serious equipment. They weren't just searching anymore. They were systematically destroying the house. They're not planning to leave witnesses, I realized. They're going to destroy everything and everyone who might have seen this evidence. Not if we get it uploaded first, Cordessa said, her fingers moving even faster across the keyboard. 70% complete. But as she spoke, I noticed something on one of the monitors that made my blood freeze. A figure in tactical gear was moving through the basement upstairs, heading directly toward the furnace area. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. They know about this room, I said urgently. Someone told them. Cordessa followed my gaze to the monitor, and her face went pale. That's not possible. Only Eldrick and I knew about this. But even as she said it, I could see her mind working, reaching the same terrible conclusion I was approaching. There had been too many convenient coincidences, too many perfectly timed arrivals. Someone with inside knowledge had been feeding information to the conspiracy all along. How did the FBI agents know to come here tonight? I asked quietly. How did they know exactly when Cordessa would be revealing the will to me? She stopped typing, her hands frozen over the keyboard. On the monitor, the tactical figure had reached the furnace and was examining the wall where Cordessa had supposedly hidden her safe earlier in the day. 85%, she whispered, resuming her typing with desperate speed. The figure on the monitors spoke into his radio, and within seconds, other team members were converging on the basement. I could hear movement above us now, the sound of heavy equipment being moved around. They're going to blow the floor, I realized. We need to get out of here. 90%, Cordessa said through gritted teeth. Just a little more time. But time was something we no longer had. The sound of drilling started above us, and dust began falling from the ceiling. They weren't just going to blow the floor. They were going to use shaped charges to breach it precisely. 95%, Cordessa announced, then suddenly stopped typing and turned to me with an expression I couldn't read. Evangeline, there's something else you need to know. The drilling stopped, and in the sudden silence, I could hear voices directly above us. We had maybe 30 seconds before they breached the room. What? I demanded. Your husband isn't dead. The words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment I couldn't process what she'd said. What do you mean he isn't dead? I watched them lower his casket into the ground 3 days ago. The heart attack was real, she said quickly, her eyes never leaving the computer screen. But we got him to the hospital in time. The funeral was a deception, part of the plan to convince the conspiracy that their primary threat had been eliminated. I felt the room spinning around me, everything I thought I knew dissolving into chaos once again. Where is he? Safe house outside the city, she replied. 100%. Upload complete. The ceiling above us exploded inward in a shower of concrete and steel, and tactical figures began rappelling down into the room. But even as they landed, Cordessa was smiling with grim satisfaction. Too late, she called out to them. The evidence is already in the hands of every major news organization in the country. By tomorrow morning, the whole world will know what you've been doing. The tactical leader pulled off his helmet, revealing a face I recognized from news broadcasts. Deputy Director Marcus Bellwether of the FBI, the same man whose name had appeared in Aldrich's emails. You have no idea what you've just done, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. That information threatens ongoing operations that are vital to national security. You mean operations that are vital to your bank account? I replied, surprising myself with my boldness. I've seen the evidence, Director Bellwether. I know how much money you've made selling weapons to terrorists. His expression hardened, and I could see him weighing his options. Around him, his tactical team kept their weapons trained on us, but there was something different in their posture now. The game had changed the moment that evidence went public. The upload can be traced and deleted, he said finally. Network security protocols can be implemented to contain the spread of information. Not if it's already gone viral, Cordessa replied calmly, and not if there are multiple copies in multiple locations. One of the tactical team members was speaking quietly into his radio, and from his expression, I could tell the news wasn't good for Bellwether's plans. The evidence was spreading faster than they could contain it. "Sir," the team member said, "we're getting reports that news stations are already running breaking news alerts. The information is everywhere." Bellwether's carefully controlled mask slipped, revealing the desperate man beneath. He'd built his career on keeping secrets, manipulating information, and eliminating inconvenient witnesses. But this was beyond his ability to control. "There are still options," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Damage control, selective disclosure, national security exemptions. There are also arrest warrants being issued." Agent Carmichael's voice called from above. I looked up to see him and Agent Rodriguez rappelling down into the room, their weapons drawn. Behind them came additional FBI agents. Real ones this time, I hoped. "Deputy Director Bellwether," Agent Carmichael announced formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, treason, and violations of the Federal Weapons Control Act." The standoff that followed felt like it lasted hours, though it was probably only minutes. Bellwether's tactical team found themselves surrounded by legitimate federal agents, their own weapons now seeming inadequate against superior numbers and legal authority. In the end, it was anticlimactic. Bellwether surrendered without additional violence, perhaps recognizing that his best chance lay in cooperation rather than continued resistance. His team followed suit, and within an hour, the house was swarming with legitimate law enforcement officers, forensic specialists, and federal prosecutors. As dawn broke over what remained of my home, I sat on the front steps with Cordessa, watching the controlled chaos of a major federal investigation. The house where I'd lived for 12 years was destroyed, but somehow that felt less important than it should have. "When can I see him?" I asked quietly. Cordessa checked her watch. "The safe house is about an hour away. Agent Carmichael says we can go there this afternoon once they've finished securing the scene here." I thought about Aldrich, alive somewhere while I had been grieving his death for 3 days. The anger I should have felt was tempered by understanding. He'd been trying to protect me, just as everyone else had been, but the deception still hurt. "Was any of it real?" I asked. "The will, the inheritance, your behavior toward me all these years?" "The will was fake, of course," she replied, "and my behavior. That was the hardest part of this entire operation, treating you like an outsider when what I really wanted was to welcome you into our family properly." She turned to face me, and I could see tears in her eyes. "You have to understand, Evangeline. From the moment Aldrich told me he was in love with you, I wanted to get to know you. But we were already deep into this investigation by then, and getting close to you would have put you in danger. So you've been protecting me since before I even knew I needed protection. Your husband loves you more than I've ever seen anyone love another person," she said. "He would have died before letting this conspiracy hurt you. In fact, he nearly did." As if summoned by our conversation, Agent Carmichael approached us with a satellite phone. "Mrs. Thornbridge, there's someone who wants to speak with you." My hands shook as I took the phone, knowing whose voice I would hear, but still not quite believing it was possible. "Evangeline?" Aldrich's voice was weak, but unmistakably alive. Unmistakably him. "Oh my God," I breathed, tears streaming down my face. "I thought you were dead. I buried you. I grieved for you." "I know, my love, and I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I hated every moment of putting you through that, but it was the only way to keep you safe while we finish this." "Are you really all right?" "The heart attack was real." "I'm going to be fine," he assured me. "The doctors say it was brought on by the stress and the chemical they used, but there's no permanent damage. I'll need time to recover, but I'm going to be fine." I looked around at the destruction of our home, at the federal agents processing evidence, at Cordessa, who was smiling through her own tears as she listened to our conversation. "What happens now?" I asked. "When this is all over, when the trials are finished and the conspiracy is exposed, what happens to us?" "Now, we get to have the life we always wanted," Aldrich said softly. "A real life, without secrets or deceptions or people trying to hurt us. We can go anywhere, do anything, be anyone we want to be." "I want to be your wife," I said simply, "wherever that takes us." "Then that's what we'll be," he replied, "starting now, starting today, starting for real this time." As I handed the phone back to Agent Carmichael, I realized that despite everything we'd lost, our home, our sense of security, years of honest communication, we'd also gained something precious. We'd gained the truth, and with it, the possibility of building something stronger than what we'd had before. Cordessa put her arm around my shoulders, and for the first time in 12 years, the gesture felt natural and welcome. "Thank you," I said to her, "for protecting me, for protecting him, for sacrificing your relationship with both of us to keep us safe. Thank you for being strong enough to handle the truth when it finally came out," she replied, "and for being brave enough to finish what Aldrich started." The sun was fully up now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded me of hope rather than endings. Around us, the investigation continued, but the immediate danger was over. The evidence was public. The conspirators were being arrested, and somewhere not far away, my husband was alive and waiting for me. 3 months later, I stood in the kitchen of our new house, a modest place outside Denver, where we'd chosen to start over. Aldrich was at the stove making breakfast, his movements still careful but growing stronger every day. Cordessa was at the kitchen table, reading news reports about the trials that were finally bringing justice to the people who'd betrayed their country. "The senator pleaded guilty yesterday," she announced. 25 years minimum." "Good," Aldrich said simply, not looking up from the eggs he was scrambling. "Maybe others will think twice before selling weapons to terrorists." I watched him move around our new kitchen, still marveling at the simple fact that he was alive, that we'd survived everything that had been thrown at us. The trials would continue for months, maybe years, but that was for other people to handle now. We'd done our part. "I have something for you," Cordessa said, reaching into her purse and withdrawing a small wrapped package, a housewarming gift. Inside was a silver picture frame containing our original wedding photo, the one that had sat on our mantelpiece in the house that was destroyed. Somehow, she'd managed to save it from the chaos. "How?" I asked, tears filling my eyes. "I may be retired from the CIA," she said with a smile, "but I never forgot how to salvage what matters most." As I looked at the photo of Aldrich and me on our wedding day, young and hopeful and completely unaware of what lay ahead, I realized that we'd come full circle. We were starting over, but this time with the foundation of truth, rather than the comfortable lies that had nearly cost us everything. The doorbell rang, and Aldrich went to answer it while I set our wedding photo on the kitchen windowsill where the morning light could catch it. When he returned, he was carrying a thick envelope marked with the logo of the Justice Department. "What's that?" I asked. "Compensation," he said, opening the envelope to reveal a substantial check, the government's way of apologizing for destroying our old life while trying to save our new one. I looked at the amount and felt my eyebrows rise. It was enough to buy a much larger house, to travel, to do anything we wanted with our second chance. "What should we do with it?" I asked. Aldrich and Cordessa exchanged a look, and I could see they'd already discussed this. "We were thinking," Cordessa said carefully, "that there might be other families who need protection from conspiracies like this one. Other people who find themselves caught between truth and danger." "A foundation," Aldrich explained, "to help families who get targeted for doing the right thing. Legal support, safe housing, financial assistance while they rebuild their lives." I thought about everything we'd been through, the fear and confusion and ultimate triumph of seeing justice done. If we could spare other families some of that pain, if we can use our experience to help rather than simply survive, it seemed like the perfect way to honor what we'd endured. "The Thornbridge Foundation for Truth and Justice," I said, testing how it sounded. "I like it," Cordessa said with satisfaction. "It has a nice ring to it." As we sat around our new kitchen table, planning how to turn our tragedy into something that could help others, I realized that the story I'd thought was ending was actually just beginning. The woman who'd stood in her driveway 3 months ago, watching mourners leave her husband's funeral, would never have imagined this outcome. But then again, she'd never imagined the strength she'd find when everything she thought she knew turned out to be a carefully constructed fiction designed to protect her. "So," I said, raising my coffee cup in a toast, "to new beginnings, to telling the truth, and to family, however complicated it might be." "To family," Aldrich agreed, touching his cup to mine. "To family," Cordessa echoed, her eyes bright with tears and laughter. Outside our kitchen window, snow was beginning to fall, the first snow of our new life together, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt completely at peace with where we were and where we were heading. The locks on our doors belonged to us now. The secrets had been revealed, and the people we loved were safe. That, I realized, was enough, more than enough. It was everything.